So, colleagues, I'm up. I've been given the sign both from my colleagues in the boardroom, as well as from those virtually, that we've got plenty of people here. I see virtually we've got at least 13 people online. We've got a couple more in the boardroom. So thanks again for joining us to discuss matters around evaluations, discuss matters around climate change and climate change interventions, and of course around the climate funds, the GCF, perhaps as well the JEF, perhaps as well the CIVs, perhaps as well the adaptation fund. So great to have you today here. As you can see on the first slide, we are online. You can find us on various media. So we are on Twitter, we are on LinkedIn, on Medium, on YouTube. So just if you care, join us and join our newsletter by just clicking or scanning this QR code here on the right-hand side. Today's session is on transformational change. And transformational change has emerged as a very important tool to address the climate crisis. Mitigation as well as adaptation intervention are striving to have transformational effects, as it is clear to the level of climate finance invested is insufficient to meet our Paris Agreement, our goals of the Paris Agreement of restricting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this learning talk today is going to present the recent work on transformational change by the IEU of the GCF, as well as the evaluation and learning initiative of the CIVs, the climate investment funds. And the talk will present the recent evidence reviews that was compiled and analyzed by both of our institutions, and was basically focusing on three key characteristics of transformational change: of the depth, the delivering a large impact, so a large effect size, if you like; of the question of duration, so an impact or impacts that remain sustainable over time, so the effects last longer than a year, for instance; and lastly, also on scale, so operating at a substantial scale, covering a large area or a large group of people. So today, I'm really pleased to have very interesting little snippets of the work that we've done jointly as well as individually. And for this, we have three presenters. We've got Martin Prowse, who is with the IEU and is, as an evaluation specialist, he has been applying his very, very extensive work experience over 15 years in international development to support the IEU's work stream on impact evaluations, evidence reviews, and behavioral science. He's published widely and is also an editor of the European Journal for Development Research. He also holds a PhD from the University of Manchester. He will speak to us first today. We've also got two other speakers, which are Neha Sharma, and Neha leads the evaluation and learning initiative of the climate investment funds. And the initiative itself is at the forefront of making CIV's learning laboratory mandate a reality through learning that is evidence-based, timely, and relevant. Neha has also over 15 years of work experience in climate, environment, economic, and social development, with a deep expertise in evaluation methods, results measurement, and learning. In the past, Neha also worked at the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank on monitoring and evaluation capacity building. She's also worked on evaluative research and program design with organizations including the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, the Indian Infrastructure Publishing, and Neha holds a master's degree in public administration from Harvard Kennedy School and a second master's degree from the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Apologies, Neha, I've tried this so many times today to say this right, but I hope that's good enough. Colleagues, lastly, I also want to introduce to you Mike Ward. He's also with us today. He's also going to speak to us about the evidence with regards to transformational change. And Mike is a senior sustainability specialist with the CIV Evaluation and Learning Initiative. He has worked at the intersection of sustainable development, learning, and change for over 25 years. Mike is currently leading the CIF's work on Transformational Change Learning Partnership, the TCLP, and contributes to the work on just transitions, strategic program evaluations, and other things. In his previous roles in the National Environmental NGO, he co-led regional programs and international consultancies. Mike has developed and conducted and evaluated global and local programs on sustainable development. He also holds a master's degree in international environmental science from Lund University and an MBA from Henley Business School. So thanks, colleagues. This is a mouthful, of course, but I'll give it just a brief introduction for the program. So we have a presentation by Martin on scale, depth, and duration examples for transformational change in the energy sector. We also have a presentation from Nea and Mike on how does the CIF's evaluation and learning initiative approach transformational change. And we really, really hope for your interesting questions and challenging questions, and we'll see what we can make of it. So over to you, Martin. Thanks for this.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for a fantastic introduction. And thank you all for joining today's learning talk. I'm going to briefly summarize some of our findings from an evidence review we completed with the CIF's Evaluation and Learning Initiative and focused on transformational change in the energy and public health sectors. Next slide, please. So the evidence review makes an ambitious attempt at improving our understanding about transformational change in the context of climate change. And it does this through covering a very precise but extensive list of interventions and outcomes in energy and behavioral change in public health. And it combines evidence gap maps that lay out the spectrum of intervention and outcome combinations with key systematic reviews in the two sectors on specific cells that have a saturated number of studies. And it offers particular examples of interventions that have shown effects with scale, depth, and duration. Next slide, please. So as Andreas outlined, for this study, we define transformational change as interventions that led to large impacts sustained over time at a large scale. So we only looked at studies that measured effect sizes, and this meant that we focused only on causal studies, on experimental or quasi-experimental studies. And this allowed us to include studies that had a measurable and specific depth of change. We also looked at studies that were sufficiently large in their scope or coverage. So this reflected the possibility of a large scale of change, and also that collected data over a long period of time. And in particular, the outcomes were measured 1 year after the intervention was implemented. So this helped us to find studies that offered examples of transformational change. And in today's presentation, we're going to solely focus on the results from one of the two sectors, from the energy sector. So in terms of the inclusion criteria that we used for the study, we focused only on studies that had at least 1,000 individual beneficiaries or targeted an administrative unit larger than a village. In terms of the energy sector, we looked at intervention types that were clustered in terms of institutional or market systems, incentives and standards, soft interventions such as nudges, and investments in infrastructure. All of the studies had a clearly defined comparison group, a control group, and the outcomes that we covered included both mitigation and adaptation outcome areas and labour market co-benefits. So to reiterate, all of the study designs focused only on causal studies, on experimental or quasi-experimental studies, and the outcomes were measured a year after the onset of the intervention. Next slide, please. So this shows the theory of change that we used for this particular part of the evidence review. So we can see that it covers 4 different intervention types, and it also covers 7 different intervention areas. So in terms of the intervention types, we focus on institutional and market systems, incentives and standards, investments in infrastructure, equipment and technologies, and also soft interventions such as education and training. In terms of the outcome areas, we focused on energy access and supply, energy market development, consumption and demand, adoption of energy efficient technologies, resilience of energy systems, with a focus on adaptation there, as well as greenhouse gas emission reductions, and we looked at labour market co-benefits. Next slide, please. So the screening and coding of studies was completed by two people, and we constructed the EGM to document evidence of where we have saturated levels of evidence and evidence gaps. And then we completed the systematic review, 2 systematic reviews in sufficiently populated cells that had identical intervention outcome combinations to estimate the overall effect sizes. Next slide, please. So this Prisma diagram shows the screening process and the coding process. So we initially threw the net out very broadly, and we pulled in over 8,000 studies, almost 9,000 studies. And we then screened at full text and abstract level 7,000 studies. And from this screening, we were left with 209 studies for full text assessment. From these, we included 96 studies in the evidence gap map. The EGM is online. It offers a great interactive resource to check the evidence gaps and also the areas where there is sufficient causal evidence. And each of the cells within the EGM offers links through to all of the individual studies that were included in the map. We focused on 2 particular cells within the EGM, and we retained 31 articles within the energy EGM for meta-analysis. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the EGM online. So we'd strongly encourage you to peruse the EGM and to check where we do have high levels of evidence and also evidence gaps within the energy EGM. We found that each of the intervention types included at least 18 studies, and we found that most studies were within the investments in infrastructure, equipment, and technology intervention type. In terms of outcomes, we found that the most populated area of outcomes meant that most studies referred to energy consumption and demand with 51 studies, greenhouse gas emissions and pollution with 42 studies, 35 studies in terms of access to energy and supply, and 30 studies in terms of labour market co-benefits. Next slide, please. So based on the EGM, we then selected 2 cells for systematic review. And we focused on 2 combinations. Firstly, the combination of electrification and the impacts on formal employment. We also focused on a very large-scale example of an emissions trading scheme. And this was the intersection between market-based mechanisms and the effects of the pilot emissions trading scheme in China and the effects on greenhouse gas emissions. So for comparability across studies, we standardized all of the effect sizes, and we calculated the standardized the mean difference in terms of Cohen's d. We also checked, as we're evaluators, we also checked the robustness of our results and used a wide variety of robustness checks and tests in terms of testing for publication bias, sources of heterogeneity, sensitivity analysis, outlier detection, and further statistical tests. Next slide, please. So as part of the systematic review, we completed 2 graphics. Firstly, a forest plot. So the forest plot aggregates the effect sizes across 12 studies that were included in the systematic review. Whilst the EGM highlighted 22 studies, only 12 of these were suitable for meta-analysis. And we also found that many of the studies referred to different metrics. So some would refer to CO2 emissions as a proportion of GDP. Others would refer to the carbon intensity of growth. Some would refer to emission reduction in nominal amounts. Others would refer to a logarithmic scale of GHG emissions. So we standardized all of these parameters. And we also need to highlight that all of these studies are based on the identical intervention, the pilot emissions trading scheme in China that was launched in 2011 and became active in 2013-14. So the graphic here, the forest plot, shows the effect of the emissions trading scheme on greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that we aggregate the effect sizes across all of the 12 studies that were included. And we find the reduction of emissions of 17% versus the control group mean. And this ranges from a decrease of 31% to about 0. And in terms of the Cohen's d, which is one way that we standardize effect sizes, the value is equivalent to -1. So this is in the range of between a large and a very large effect size. Next slide, please. We then applied a range of robustness checks and tests to the studies that were included for the meta-analysis. And here we present this in a funnel plot. So a funnel plot shows the relationship between estimate quality and the effect size. So each dot is one of the studies in the meta-analysis, and the y-axis shows the standard errors, which convey the precision of the estimates, and on the x-axis we have the effect sizes. And we expect studies with high precision to be very close to the average line illustrated here along the x-axis. Studies with low precision should be spread evenly across both sides of the average. And in the plot here, we can see some imbalance in terms of the location of the studies, in terms of their standard error and their effect size. In particular, we find that studies with larger standard errors, in other words, wide confidence intervals, also show very large effect sizes. And we also find a number of studies are very close to the significance lines. And due to this hinted at a form of sort of publication bias within this group of studies. And due to that, we ran a robustness check. So that's called the Eggers test. And that essentially regresses the standardized mean effect size against the standard errors, and that came through as significant. So because of that, we continue to assess the potential for bias within this set of studies and the estimates that we'd developed. So for example, we reran the analysis and we removed the one outlier that we can see here with a very, very large standard errors and also a very, very large effect size. And we found that this reduced the effect size by 4 percentage points. We also ran an unbiased estimate in terms of a procedure where we could estimate the effect of the Chinese emissions trading scheme on greenhouse gas emissions without any form of publication bias. And we found that this reduced the effect size from 17% down to 7%. And in terms of transformational change, what this meant was that this would then bring the Cohen's d value down from 1, which was above a large effect size, which was a threshold we used for transformational change, down to around half of that. So more in terms of a medium effect size, which was underneath our threshold for transformational change. Next slide, please. So the second meta-analysis we completed on the energy EGM was on the effect of electrification on formal employment. So really focusing on an adaptation co-benefit. And overall, we found a 2% increase, and it was interestingly, this was mainly driven by greater employment of women in the formal labour market, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And as we're evaluators, we also tested the robustness of this finding, and we had to revise this down given the heterogeneity and publication bias that we found. In essence, we found a very large effect in published papers and very, very small effects in grey literature, indicating that there'd been a bit of cherry picking going on in terms of the studies that were selected into journals. And when we completed and calculated the revised Cohen's D, we found a very, very small effect size increase of only 0.03. So this is way below the small effect size of 0.2 and very, very much below the transformational threshold of 0.8. Next slide, please. So this has offered a flavor of the very rich set of results and data and findings we have within this almost exhaustive evidence review on transformational change on the energy sector and on behavioral change in public health. And the evidence review really contributes to our understanding of transformational change by covering a precise, extensive list of interventions and outcomes, combining EGMs with systematic reviews in the two sectors, and offering specific examples of interventions that have shown effects with scale, depth, and duration, and has also illustrated how we need to be very cautious when we're making claims around transformational change and conduct a full suite of sensitivity tests and robustness checks. And so the findings from the energy sector that we presented today show that the Chinese pilot emissions trading scheme shows considerable effects, but these are likely to be below the threshold set for transformational change in this particular review. And we also found that the effects of electrification on formal employment also fall considerably below this threshold. And I'd encourage you to explore all of the resources that are online for this evidence review. And with that, I'll hand back to our moderator, Andreas, and onto our further presenters. Over to you, Andreas.
Thanks, colleagues. Thanks, Martin. Thanks, colleagues, for listening in to this exciting, yet somewhat disappointing result that we had from our evidence review and meta-analysis. Just to say in one more sentence, the idea for global evidence review is always the same. It's the question of, can we know more about what's going on globally? What do we know about impacts? What works? What doesn't? And for whom? And then when we delve into the conversation here with energy and health, as we did for this evidence review, we looked at, and is it true what we're finding? And here that is this, very interesting map of mapping gaps. And then the results unfortunately show that even for those that seemed promising, we have considerable doubt with regards to the biases that one could find in the global literature. Again, very, very interesting. Over to our next presenters with Nea and Mike to hear a little bit about the other front of transformational change, to basically the learning and evaluation initiative, to see a little bit of how the CIVs are handling the question of transformational change as well. Over to you, Nea and Mike. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Andreas, and a huge thank you to GCF IEU for inviting us to speak with GCF colleagues. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And welcome to the participants in person and also online. I also wanted to extend a thank you to Martin for collaborating with us so closely on the study that he just presented. Martin managed some quite tricky negotiations between organizations to complete the study, and he did this very capably because on the upfront we had to agree how we're going to quantify transformational change, and you can imagine those conversations were detailed and tricky. The study took quite a while because it was very difficult to do. And here again, I want to thank Martin for his patience and perseverance as we went through some long processes and wait times. But I think one of the important lessons, even if the results are a bit disappointing coming, is for us as evaluators to be very careful about the conclusions that we're making and their limitations. So that's, I think, one big lesson for us that we learn and relearn all the time. And I'd say the second one is the methodology constraints. So the study looked at only causal studies, and we knew upfront that that's going to lead to a limited set of types of evidence that can be used to make conclusions. And of course, we saw that play out. So. And it was interesting for the climate investment funds and for me personally to be part of this adventure, because our approach at the CIF is very mixed methods focused, and we do some modeling work, and of course we believe in quantitative evidence and rigor and all the things that went into the study as well. But our approach is very mixed methods heavy. So to look at this as causal studies that are more quantitative and try and quantify something that we approach generally from a more contextual perspective was quite an adventure. So thank you again for collaborating with us and for inviting us today. And with that, I'll request the organizers to move to the next slide, please. This presentation is mostly going to be delivered by my colleague, Mike, but I just wanted to start by introducing the Evaluation and Learning Initiative of the Climate Investment Funds, because it's quite different to the GCF-IEU. The first thing that makes it quite different is we are an internal unit. So we're not an independent evaluation unit set up within a climate fund. The reason for that is that our implementing agencies are only multilateral development banks, so 5 MDBs. Each of these MDBs have their own independent evaluation units. So we don't do project level tracking or validation reports or those micro and macro traditional evaluations that are necessary because these independent evaluation units of the MDBs do those. We were set up to take forward SIP's learning laboratory mandates. There's a very high emphasis on the learning aspects of the work that we do, or in the work that we do. We do programmatic or thematic evaluations that look across the portfolio of projects on a theme, but that means that they look across MDBs because no single MDB evaluation unit has the mandate to do independent evaluations that are projects and programs outside the purview of their own MDB projects. So we do accountability focused, thematic, programmatic evaluations that are commissioned out and managed by us, but we do a lot of internal evaluative work and learning work. So the Evaluation and Learning Initiative has 3 objectives. These are quite obvious and are usually the objectives of any evaluation and learning unit, but we generate new evidence in priority areas. We work very hard to apply that learning in country and institutions, and we do this through various modalities. And we fulfill objective 1 and 2 with support from objective 3, which is to foster collaborations and partnerships. So there's rarely a moment that we're doing something just the SIF alone. In everything that we do, we collaborate with different partners. We use the SIP's programmatic approach with the intent of broad stakeholder consultations, also to develop multi-year business plans for the Evaluation and Learning Initiative. And through these multi-year business plans, we come up with our priority learning themes. So the themes that you see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, were reached at after we spoke to over 100 of our stakeholders, 40 different organizations, including GCF Secretariat and GCF Independent Evaluation Unit, to try and understand where is the landscape and what are the important learning gaps, and we put them in broad themes. So the big themes that we work on are just transition, transformational change, development impacts of climate finance, how to scale up climate finance, and then some program and sector specific topics that include the program level evaluations that I was speaking about before. And then cross-cutting across these themes are the themes of gender, social inclusion, and stakeholder engagement. So I just wanted to give this brief introduction to the Evaluation and Learning Initiative. And I know that the topic for today is transformational change. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Mike, to take us through the SIP's transformational change framework. And Mike, over to you. And Mike leads the transformational change work that we do under the E&L initiative.
Thanks, Neha, and thanks, Andreas and the GCF team for hosting us, and I think for contributing to all of the work that I'm about to share through an initiative called the Transformational Change Learning Partnership, a partnership of over 600 individuals, around 350 institutions that have been thinking about transformational change and how we achieve it. I think that there's a big recognition with both the urgency and the scale of the climate crisis that many small incremental changes are not going to be sufficient to address the real crisis that we face, and that we will need deep systemic, fundamental systemic change, often referred to as transformational change. The one challenge that we hit as we started to work with transformational change, I think all of us, was how do we define it? And so some of the initial work, and I'll share a definition that the TCLP has developed, but some of the initial work was around refining a definition of transformational change, and then to try and identify some dimensions that need to be present in order for us to achieve this transformational change. So I'll share those dimensions. I'll share a little bit around the use of guiding questions and why we've adopted the use of questions in our evaluative work. And then sometimes the answers to questions are limited. And so we've started to open up a discussion around signals, I suppose the kinds of emergent or advanced outcomes or processes that we would expect to see if transformational change were happening. I'll work through each of those. If we move to the next slide, please. So a quick comment on the definition. Martin introduced the notion of scale, depth, and duration, all important considerations in transformational change. I think that they're captured a little bit in this definition, which is defining transformational change as fundamental change in systems relevant to climate action with large-scale positive impacts that shift and accelerate the trajectory of progress towards climate neutral, inclusive, resilient, and we're increasingly adding equitable and sustainable development pathways. So in there is this kind of notion of large-scale impact. The notion of positive impact, I think, needs to be carefully considered. And more we're realizing that transformational change can happen in ways that are both good or bad. In other words, it's agnostic about the direction that it moves in, and that we actually need to embed certain normative ideals into our work on transformational change in order to achieve the kind of change that we want to see. And hence this focus on climate neutrality, inclusivity, resilience, equity, and sustainable development. If we move to the next slide. So in the work of the Transformational Change Learning Partnership, these 5 dimensions were identified as needing to be present in some way in order for transformational change to occur. So the first thing is the relevance of initiatives to support change in particular contexts, the need for systemic change, the need to focus on speed given the urgency, but it's also speed that recognizes complexity and the need not to leave anybody behind. In other words, the just transition focus. The issue of scale, I think Martin has covered really well already. And then this notion of adaptive sustainability, partly linked to duration, but it's the ability to continue to learn and improve as new situations emerge. So those are the dimensions. Of course, they are in some ways tricky to work with. So if we move to the next slide. So we started to develop questions that might help to probe what these dimensions would look like. And we recognize that many of the issues that we're grappling with in terms of climate change are contextual. They play out in different ways in different places. They're complex. They often link multiple complex systems. We're working in Zimbabwe around the Zambezi watercourse, and there are agricultural systems, there are industrial systems, there are domestic use systems around water, and so incredibly complex work that we're needing to grapple with. And as a result, the issues are often contested. Farmers may want access to water high up in a catchment, industry may want access to water further down in the catchment, and of course, things like domestic use are a basic human right. And so there's high contestation between different stakeholders with different interests. And of course, these issues are changing over time. If we look at the Zambezi catchment, until now, it's had lots of water in it. With climate change, and there's a good chance that there will be drought and there will be much higher levels of stress around who gets water and who doesn't in that process. And of course, we don't know all of the answers in advance to these questions and to what transformational change needs to look like. And therefore, we're using the questions to help us provide flexible guidance for transformative program design, the implementation, review, and learning. And I'll come back to some of the different ways in which this is actually being used in evaluative work. If we move to the next slide. So a quick look at some of the questions that we're using. These are relatively high-level questions. So around relevance, a useful question seems to be what is required in a particular context. So what is going into, for example, regional plans, what is going into nationally determined contributions or national development plans. They often articulate what is required in either a region or a country, or with integrated development plans, what is required locally. And then what is planned? So what are the initiatives actually seeking to do? And really importantly, are they aligned? So we don't land up with projects being implemented just because they're a kind of pet or have a particular vested interest behind them, but that they're actually responding to what is required in context. The question around systemic change is twofold. So what systems need to change and how? And then because system boundaries are often reflect particular interests, we need to ask the question, who needs to be involved and how? So who needs to be involved in the conversations around what systems boundaries are put in place and what systems need to change and how? So it's an issue of inclusivity, yeah. And then around speed, what is this relationship between urgency, the need to move very quickly, and complexity, the need to acknowledge that we need to take everybody, or at least many people, with us in these processes. And this tension, I think, in the speed discussions. What scaling is required? It's scaling of different kinds, vertical scaling around policy from global to local, policy work, both the design of policy and its implementation. There are issues around horizontal scaling, so how many people are involved, what scope of geographic area is included. And then what we refer to as depth scaling, the levels of understanding and support for particular initiatives. And then the issue of adaptive capacity. So what capacity will be built to achieve sustainable development pathways? I think it's an important place for things like monitoring, evaluation, and learning to be focused on, as well as what institutional capacity and individual capacity needs to be built. The trick with these questions, if we just move back to the previous slide, the trick with the questions is that there is a risk that if people have simple understandings of the issues, the answers may be relatively simple and untransformational. And so we're starting to work with this notion of signals, which help us to kind of articulate what kinds of change would we have in mind or expect to see, what level of change, often drawing on things like international commitments, human rights declarations, etc. So we can go to relatively shared spaces and say, these are the kinds of changes that we're working towards, and what would the world look like if we took these seriously. We move to the next slide. So those were the sort of high-level questions. Around each of those, we've developed more detailed questions. Questions around outcomes. So what questions, what fundamental changes or large-scale positive impacts relative to climate action need to be brought about? And there we may have emerging signals, maybe that it's included in country investment plans, or advanced signals that we can actually see the change starting to play out in, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. And then also the how questions, so the kinds of processes that need to be in place in order to achieve these outcomes. And again, we've got specific questions in there that focus on process alignment, for example, and then the kinds of processes that we would expect to see in place as signals. And we've developed these questions for each of the dimensions, and we're working with them in different ways. And I'll maybe just share one of those ways if we move to the next slide. So the next slide is a piece of work that was done by ICF. It was part of a large external evaluation of the Scaling Up Renewable Energy Program in Low-Income Countries, SREP. And at one point in that study was a summary of some of the dimensions of transformational change and the kind of change that they were seeing happening across the many different case studies that they were looking at. So they did case studies in a number of countries and started to see this evidence of relevance really deeply embedded in projects, or systemic change where it was happening sometimes, and also a recognition that at times there was kind of weak sectoral influence which limited the depth of systemic change. Scaling similarly, so what kinds of scaling were being worked on? Was it happening just in one particular area, or were we seeing a whole of market scale in some of the smaller, less developed countries? So really large scale for that country. As speed, they gave examples of an adaptive sustainability. So it was a way, retrospectively, at the kind of end of a process, looking back, a kind of review of quite a mature SIF program, and able to start to tease out some of the different dimensions. I've mentioned we're working in Zimbabwe at the moment. We're currently doing a similar piece of work, but at the diagnostic stage. How do we understand the Zambezi catchment and what needs to happen in it? And we've been running workshops with people from many different countries, from government institutions, from regional organizations like ZAMCOM, and trying to probe these dimensions around relevance, systemic change, using the questions in a diagnostic way that will then feed into the design work, design evaluations, the implementation work as they start to be implemented, the formative evaluative work, and then, like this one, a kind of more summative evaluation. So that was a kind of summary piece, and then one last slide on an ICF piece, if we move to the next slide. And here, what ICF were doing, we're just giving small examples of, for example, relevance. At what level were they seeing it? So maybe it was just emerging in least cost rural electrification planning in Honduras, and then they would develop that through the evaluation and provide kind of evidence of it, draw on that, and make some of these findings. So it can be done kind of all of the dimensions. Or particular dimensions. I think that one of the things that we're learning is that really there needs to be some evidence of working across all 5 of those dimensions for truly transformational change to be happening. If we move to the next slide. So I'm going to hand back to Neha just to kind of, I think, summarize and give an overview of some of the way that we're using this work.
Thanks so much, Mike. And I think we've gone a bit over time than planned, so I'll try and rush through this. But this slide is just to explain a little bit that we're incorporating the transformational change work that Mike just described, the whole framework, into the SIF's existing and new programs, but with this emphasis on new programs, because when the existing program started, which was 12 years ago, we didn't have this framework. This framework was built after that. And the evaluation team's intention is to make sure that it's incorporated through the program and project cycle. So starting with investment criteria, the dimensions that Mike spoke to are part of SIF's investment criteria for new programs. There are various points in time where we make presentations to experts that may be selecting the countries that are then developing the investment plans as part of SIF's programmatic approach, the various capacity building workshops that we deliver through the chain of the program cycle, including in inception, design, and implementation. And Mike's already shared an example of how this framework is used in the end for more summative work. But the intention is to use it for both formative implementation and summative evaluative work. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but just to say that the evaluation and learning initiatives work sits within a broader integrated results framework of the climate investment funds and a MEL policy, a monitoring, evaluation, and learning policy. But I'm going to skip through this. So next slide, please. And this last slide is just to do a bit of a pitch of the most recent launch by the ENL initiative, which is our Just Transition Planning Toolbox. The link is on the side of the slide. But we've been doing a lot of work on developing a just transition framework, and as we're doing for transformational change, incorporating the just transition principles and frameworks into SIF operations and really mainstreaming this. As part of that work, we've developed a toolbox for countries, funds, MDBs, a lot of our different stakeholders to be able to use it to plan for just transitions. It has over 200 different curated resources that includes tools by other organizations. It includes case studies and empty templates and things that can be used to plan for a just transition across the 5 identified steps and multiple sub-steps that can be taken. So it's quite an extensive piece of work. If you're interested, please look at the link and I'm happy to answer any questions on it. So with that, and with apologies for taking a few extra minutes, I'm going to pass it back to Andres.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, of course, Neha, for a very eloquent way of describing what these SIFs are thinking about and doing, and obviously also showing the TCLP Learning Partnership Initiative on Transformational Change and how we've been thinking about the signals. Colleagues, I'll leave you at this and say, please join us next month. We've got a great topic. And the topic is as follows. It's space, place, and scale, the value of GIS in climate investments. So we're looking at the spatial analysis and the stuff that we've done so far, and if it's relevant for climate investments. So join us again next month. Thank you for tuning in. Please stay in touch, talk about it, reach out to our speakers today if you want to have more information on all the different things. Everything is in the meeting chat here, so go click, go through the CIF's work, go through the IEU's work, and stay safe and happy and healthy. Thank you very much. And thanks to the team in Songdo here in the boardroom for helping us so ably to do this today. Over and out.